Hi, Sean Rooney here, Chief Executive Officer of Leading Age Services Australia, and it's my great pleasure to be presenting for our members the LASER State of the Industry 2019 presentation. Now, we're very fortunate to have the support of a good friend to LASER, First State Super, as the sponsor for the presentation and the breakfast series we conducted this year. They're a good friend to LASER and a good friend to our industry, and we thank them for their support. The purpose of today's presentation is to provide directors and executives in age services organisations around the country insight into the key issues that are currently at play in our industry. Now, the structure of today's presentation is I'll provide some overview, just industry context information, and then take a deeper dive into looking at the industry from 5 perspectives. Those being access to services, funding of services, the quality of those services, the delivery of those services through the workforce, and finally looking at the reputation of the industry. And then I'll close off with some final comments. At the end of each section, I will stop and just provide to the audience some insights into key issues that we see arising, and some questions for you. If you're running a business or if you're governing a business, these are the things that I'd be thinking about for each of those key categories. So if we kick off now, industry context. Now, for those of you that have been in the industry for a while, you'll understand that we've been undergoing a significant reform agenda over the past few years. The Productivity Commission reported in 2011 that there were a number of shortcomings with the aged care industry as it was at the time, and the response from the government of the day was the Living Longer, Living Better reform agenda. Now, we've been working through those reforms since 2012, and it's interesting to note that a recent parliamentary inquiry headed by Trent Zimmerman reported in 2018 that notwithstanding the reform journey that we've been on and some of the benefits that have been realised and the reforms that have been achieved, in his view, and I would suggest the view of many others, there is still more work to do. Now, you can't have a conversation in Australia today about aged care without considering the Aged Care Royal Commission. So it's important to note a couple of key things that the Commission will be looking into. Firstly, the raison d'etre for the Commission was a combination of, as they stated, the rising torrent of concern with regards to increases in issues around safety and quality, and also a concern that the system may not be fit for purpose looking into the future. Now, there's two very distinct lines of inquiry for the Royal Commission. One is around trying to understand what's currently working and, importantly, what's not working in the system. But then also to determine what does good practice, good quality and innovation look like to ensure that we have a future fit aged care system that will be designed to meet not only the needs of older Australians now, but also the growing number of older Australians as the baby boomers age. And so specifically, the Royal Commission has stated repeatedly, and LASER has also supported this, that this Royal Commission is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually create a better aged care system for all older Australians. And just drawing on some direct quotes from the commissioners at the conclusion of the directions hearing, they were quite strident in their assertion that the hallmark of a civilised society is how it treats its most vulnerable. Frail and elderly members of our community deserve to and should be looked after in the best possible way, and the commitment the commissioners have made to the country is that they intend to do their best to see that this happens. So now, if we look at the aged services industry in some further detail, the first lens we'll apply now is access to services. Now, on the screen you'll see a demographic change looking at the proportion of population aged over 65 out to 2097. Now, these are very common graphs that we see regularly. The important thing to note is that since 2017 we are on the steepest part of that transition to the new normal with regards to the numbers of older Australians in our communities. Now, this is a good thing. It's a sign of success of society. However, it does present not only opportunities but also some challenges for governments and providers in the community alike. it was interesting that COTA, the Council of the Ageing, conducted some recent surveys of their members where they looked at access to services from a consumer perspective and reported that some 20% of people who were trying to access services had trouble. And the top 3 difficulties that they experienced was barriers around cost, long waiting lists, or lack of services available in their location. Our friends at National Seniors also conducted some research last calendar year as well, where they surveyed their members on any number of issues with regards to aged care. In one of the questions they put to those being surveyed was, were your needs met by the assessment conducted, either a RAS or an ACAT? And around 50% of people were actually dissatisfied with their needs, as they felt that they weren't being met. And furthermore, in that particular survey, there was a great quote which really gave insight into the experience of a consumer operating in a system that is seeking to provide consumer choice. And that statement was, the main problem with aged services is you don't know what you don't know. And when a problem comes up, one's not too sure how and where to obtain the right information. Now, if we move on from trying to understand the barriers to accessing services, of those that are currently receiving services, on the screen now you'll see that around 70% of Australians aged over 85, so 7 out of 10 Australians aged 85 or more currently receive services through the aged care system, and around 33% or 1 in 3 of people aged over 70 access aged care in the current system, and that's across home support, CHSP, or home care packages, as well as residential care. Of those people accessing the services, around 2/3 are getting that lower level care in the home through CHSP, and around 21% is in residential aged care. Now, the government target for subsidised places, so this is the availability of places in home care and also residential care, is that by 2022, for every 1,000 people aged over 70, there'll be 125 subsidised places. And now those places are split between residential care and home care, and you'll see over time that the number of home care packages continues to grow, whilst over time the number of residential care places has reduced. Now that's consistent with the Living Longer, Living Better reform agenda to support older Australians to age in place. Again, I think the issue here though is if you look at the number of places we brought on stream in the last few years, as opposed to those number of places that we need to bring online in the next short few years, there are some challenges there for government with regards to being able to fund those places, but also for industry with the ability to be able to scale up to meet that demand. If we take a deeper look at residential aged care, you'll see on the slides there around 1/3 of people in residential aged care today score high across the ACFI. So this is for ADLs, cognitive behaviour and complex health care. And underlying in that cohort receiving residential care, there are significant additional levels of acuity and conditions that need to be managed. This is people with diagnoses of depression, people with cognitive decline through dementia or other issues, and also other mental health and behavioural conditions. All of this is, I guess, saying that the level of care and acuity is increasing, and the models of care need to be able to keep pace with that need. If you look at the supply side in residential aged care, what we see over time is the continual reduction in the number of approved providers, some 20% reduction in approved providers over the past 7 years. And interestingly, within that mix, the number of for-profit providers as a proportion of the total has increased by around 5%, whereas the number of the number of for-profit providers has reduced by 5%, where the number of not-for-profit providers has actually increased by the same amount. Now the slide on the screen at the moment is a little busy, but if you look at it in two halves, on the left-hand side you can see this is the number of homes that are single site, number of operators that have 2 to 6 homes, number of operators that have 7 to 19 homes or 20 or more homes. What we see here is that the residential care facility market is still dominated by single site operators. That is, around 2/3 of all approved providers operate from a single facility. Now, conversely, if you look at on the right-hand side of the screen, the number of places allocated to those different scales of approved providers, we see that although there's only 21 operators that operate 20 or more facilities, they control over 61,000 of the current beds, and that would be a significant proportion, 40% or more, 30% or more of the current number of allocated bed licences. With residential care, obviously occupancy is a key factor to consider, and the Aged Care Financing Authority reported in its most recent report average occupancy in the last financial year. They reported 16-17 sitting at just under 92%. To put that into context, the most recent Stuart Brown survey suggested that occupancy was higher than that, around 95%, and peak occupancy back in the early noughties was around 97%. In my engagement with LASER members in recent times, there's a general feel that the occupancy level is probably still sitting around 92%. If we take a deeper look at home care, you'll see on the slide here that basically we have the home care supply side dominated by not-for-profit providers, and you can see that across each of the levels of the packages that are provided. And as of June 2017, again, Aged Care Financing Authority figures, of the 71,500 packages that were being delivered at that date, 58,000 odd were being delivered by not-for-profit providers. It was also worth to note that in that last reported financial year, 16-17, there were 97,500 packages that were delivered throughout that financial year, and that was an increase of around 10% on the previous financial year. On the screen now, you'll see some modelling that LASER has been doing, and if you look at the bar on the extreme right of the screen, this is the current home care wait list as reported by the federal government as at the end of December 2018. So we currently see just under 130,000 older Australians who have been assessed as requiring care in their homes but are unable to access that either at all or are accessing services below their assessed level of need. Now, this is an issue for the government and for industry, but most importantly, it's an issue for the older Australians that actually require care in their home and just can't get it. And in a reform agenda that's predicated on delivering an outcome for ageing in place, it's fair to say that we have around 90,000 subsidised packages that are fully subscribed in the home care system, and we have now 130,000 older Australians unable to access care either at all or at their level of need. There is a very real human cost for those people who cannot access that care, and the Register of Older South Australians has done some significant research being able to show the cost in financial terms, but also in health terms and unfortunately in mortality terms of not being able to deliver care for people in their homes when they need it. Now, the report on government services, again a Productivity Commission report looking back to the previous financial year, basically shows the wait times for access to services from an ACAT approval. On average, around 15% of people will receive a service through the home care program within 1 month or less of being assessed as requiring care. Around 30% will receive that service in 1 to 3 months, and then well over half will receive that at some time longer than that 3 months. Again, in the recent modelling that LASER has done and surveyed of our members, we found that 12 to 24 months was not uncommon for older Australians seeking to receive care to actually receive a package. And again, further modelling from LASER, if you look at the number of home care approvals alongside the number of active home care packages, you'll see the modelling that we've done that basically says that the approvals continue to grow. The packages, whilst they are growing, are not growing at the same pace, and so we just see a widening of the gap between people being assessed as requiring care and people actually receiving care. And this is, as I said earlier, an issue that we need to solve as a country in order to better support those older Australians who choose to age in place. Finally, if we also look at the number of home care packages and the number of providers, it's pretty static, around 500 providers over the period up to just before the increasing choice in home care changes were implemented. And the number of packages over that 5-year period increased by around 20,000. If we go back to the February in 2017, when the reforms that deregulated the home care market came into play, what we've now seen is an increase of around 400 or so home care providers coming into the market, whilst in real terms probably the number of packages has increased by about 15,000. Now, you would be well familiar with the Royal Commission's recent hearings with regards to home care and how we're having to see that this concentrated market is driving a number of behaviours around pricing and transparency and competitive behaviours that is counterproductive to a degree with regards to meeting the needs of older Australians and certainly supporting them to have informed choice with regards to their services. I've also included in the slides some reference to seniors housing and retirement villages, although not regulated by the federal government and seen in their eyes as part of the aged care system. This is actually fundamentally, for anybody in the industry, realises the role that seniors housing and RVs play with respect to aged care. So on the access side, there's around 2,200 retirement villages in the country. Average age of a new resident is around 75 and the average age of current residents is around 81. If you look at the factors that determine someone moving into a retirement village, the top 4 things that they're looking for is a safe environment, an environment that supports them to age well, age easily, on-site maintenance, and access to medical services. And the medical services one is something that has been slowly on the increase with regards to these surveys over time, where people are seeking to have either medical services or aged care services provided in their home or co-located with their village. Village occupancy last financial year was just under 90%. When I talk to RV operators, they say that's probably about on trend. And so if we just stop and reflect about what's actually happening with respect to access issues in the industry now, there is a number of things that if I'm sitting in your shoes as a director or as an executive in an aged services organisation, I'd be asking myself. So there's going to be further reforms around better supporting informed choice and consumer-directed care. So that's an area to watch. Residential aged care facilities, if you're operating a res care facility, keeping an eye on your occupancy to see how that's affecting your financial performance. Resolving the growing national queue in home care is obviously a key issue, as is the implementation issues around increasing choice in home care that we're currently having to work through at the moment, including the integration of CHSP and HCP, which has now been moved out to 2022 in the most recent budget. So if I'm sitting in your shoes, the questions I'm asking myself, or what as a director I'd be asking the executive, so how are we accommodating and facilitating the growing desire for consumer choice and their changing expectations? How's our occupancy trending? What are our plans for new builds or refurbishment? And if we're in the home care business, how are we defending or indeed growing our home care and CHSP operations? And the continuum of care model across accommodation, in-home care and residential care facilities continues to expand, and they would be areas that you would want to be considering. So if we now move on to looking at funding in a bit more detail, the Aged Care Financing Authority reported in 16-17 that aged care is big business. It's $22 billion of revenue, that's around 1% of GDP. The government spend is $17 billion, and interestingly, consumer contributions are now just under $5 billion, which sometimes gets lost in the conversation. If you look at the report on government services from the Productivity Commission, you can see over the past few years There's been quite a bit of variation across the states in a real recurrent expenditure per older person, and notwithstanding the 16-17 reductions in funding, we can see that 17-18 as an average has actually shown a small increase. If we look at the funding from the federal government's perspective, out to 21-22, they had projected a $22 billion spend. In the most recent budget, by 22-23, that figure reaches $25 billion. To put that into context, by that financial year, the hospital spend will be around $26 billion, and the Medicare spend, the Medicare benefits schedule, will be around $30 billion. So this is a significant proportion of the Australian government's budget. And to put that into further context, on this particular slide, on the left-hand axis, the vertical axis, you see real expenditure growth as a percent. And on the horizontal axis, you'll see the percentage share of GDP. And to put this into context with the other areas of the federal budget, aged care is growing faster than any other spend, with the exception of disability services. And that current spend is around 1% of GDP. Now, if we try to put that into context with respect to other developed nations, the OECD average for aged care spend is 1.4%. And now it's always a little challenging to be able to do international comparisons. But the Parliamentary Budget Office was making this point just recently in anticipation of the budget, that notwithstanding the amount of money we currently spend, that the declining workforce ratio, that is the number of people in paid employment relative to the number of people over the age of 65 or over the working age, continues to decline. And this is going to create a further fiscal pressure for the federal government in their budget, particularly as they're now needing to allocate even more money, as we saw in the earlier slide, growing at 6% per annum, to be able to effectively meet the needs of older Australians as they age. And interestingly enough, Faster Horses, which is a marketing company in the West, did some really insightful research with the general population, where they put to them a number of statements around our industry. And in response to the statement, there is not enough funding given to the aged care industry, that was actually well supported by around 75% of people. Now, this is a conversation that the nation hasn't had recently, but it absolutely we think will play out in the context of the federal government and beyond, particularly through the Royal Commission. Further research around funding, and this was from the National Seniors recent survey in 2018. In response to the question, are you prepared to pay for your own aged care in line with your capacity to pay, around 80% of respondents said that they were quite happy to pay commensurate with their ability to do so. Basically, they said this is the Australian way. Now, notwithstanding that sentiment, in response to the question, do you understand how consumer contributions for aged care are assessed, around 80% of people said no. So we've got a group out there that are willing to contribute to the cost of their care, but regrettably, they don't know what they're actually paying for. So again, this is an issue around informed choice and a role for providers to be able to help consumers understand those issues. If we look at residential care performance in a more granular way, ACFA in 16-17 financial year reported that the net profit before tax and the EBITDA margin was slightly above the longer term average. To put this into context, this particular slide looks at the performance of groupings across residential care providers, and there's a couple of interesting things to note. Firstly, metropolitan providers outperformed the long-term average. Now, that's as an aggregate group. Now, there'd be some metropolitan providers that may not have done so, but as a group, there's something about metropolitan providers that shows that they perform above the average. Single homes also performed above the average, as did the larger scale providers with 20 or more homes. So I think it's insightful that within those groups, there's something that particular organisations have been doing and doing well with regards to their financial performance. And the recent announcement from government where they've provided $320 million into the residential care sector is very welcomed, although, as we've long argued, not enough. Our friends at Stewart Brown have done some modelling with regards to that one-off subsidy and the increase or the impact of that increase on the earnings before tax per bed per day. And what you see here is the line at the bottom shows the survey average, so basically an industry average of the effect of that increase, and it says that it does basically lift up by about $4.60 or $4.70 or so per bed per day. So that's a welcome relief, but it is a one-off subsidy. The top line there is actually the top quartile. And the thing to note here is that whilst the survey average shows that many organisations are doing it tough in residential aged care, with that top quartile there are a number of organisations that are going quite well. And I've been talking to Stewart Brown about how we unpack that a little bit further, because I think there's some lessons to be learnt there for the industry to understand what it is that those organisations in the top 25 are doing and doing well that's delivering those good financial performance. The other thing I would note that notwithstanding all of that, going back to Trent Zimmerman's recent inquiry, he did note in his final report that the operation and the funding of the residential aged care system was designed at a time when the profile of the sector was very different. And he goes on to note that the needs and expectations of people coming into residential care have changed, but the aged care model has not adequately responded. And this is again an issue that we continue to raise with government, that we don't believe the system settings have kept pace with the needs of older Australians, particularly in residential aged care. Also with residential aged care, just looking at the bond pool, the most recently reported figure from the Aged Care Financing Authority is the bond pool is now around $25 billion. If you look at the mix between those consumers that are paying RADs and those that are paying DAPs, what we're seeing over the past few years is a decline in the RADs and a commensurate increase in the DAPs. And for some providers, that is creating an issue that they need to manage. In home care, if we just look at the headline numbers, total expenses for home care was around 1.65 billion, total revenue 1.85, and around 75% of providers realised a net profit in 15-16. Notwithstanding that, across the board, all providers, whether not-for-profit, for-profit or government, realised a decrease in EBITDA across all services. And if you unpack that a little bit further, you'd see that the EBITDA figure or earnings before tax figure between December 17 and December 18, and these are the most recent Stewart Brown figures, you'd see a slight increase across the combined totals, but small increases in level 2 and level 3 packages, but significant decline in level 4 packages. And one of the big issues here that we need to come to grips with, whilst we have a growing wait list for residential aged care, is the increasing value and volume of the unspent funds. Stewart Brown currently report that it's close to $7,000 per client of unspent funds, and the Aged Care Financing Authority noted in their most recent report that this is an area of concern that we need to actually investigate further. Particularly if those funds could be better spent or reallocated to help support those older Australians on the wait list. And just now looking at seniors housing, so in retirement villages, around 53% of villages recorded the same or better sales in 17-18, and the two-bedroom ILU national average price continued to increase over the past few years. The deferred management fee, which is one of the key instruments in the contracting process and business model for retirement villages, the most recent report in 2018 from PwC found that around 93% of villages applied a deferred management fee of 36% or less of the unit purchase price. But it was quite interesting, another piece of research, when consumers were asked, do you think that the exit fees or deferred management fees are fair? Only 21% of residents felt that that was an appropriate tool to use in the contracting process. So notwithstanding that this is a core part of the current business model, if you ask the consumers in a consumer-directed care environment, there's something that they're quite dissatisfied with. So I'm sitting in your shoes, I'm either on the board or I'm in the executive team. Here's the things I'd be thinking about. So the cost price squeeze between rising costs and stagnant subsidies continues to be an issue, particularly in residential care, but now also playing out in home care. The RAD-DAP trends could well be an issue for some providers. So if I'm in a residential care facility, I'd be keeping an eye on that one. And increasing competition, declining profitability and pricing transparency reforms in home care also would be continuing to occupy my mind. And notwithstanding all of that, the sustainable funding strategy for the overall industry, as flagged by Zimmerman and also noted by ACFA, is an area of interest for Laser and obviously for our members. So again, if I'm sitting in your shoes, I'd be asking what's the impact on financial performance of longer term viability and investment confidence in the business. I'd be looking at my business model around costing and pricing decisions. I'd be also going back and running the slide rule over any investment decisions I had with refurbs or new builds. And getting back to the point I made earlier about Stuart Brown's top quartile of residential care performers, I'd be very interested to know what they're doing with regards to how they run their businesses, their service mix, their pricing, etc., in order to understand what they're doing differently or better that's delivering those financial results. So now we'll take a more in-depth look at the quality of aged care. If you look at the last reported figures from the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner, we see that in last financial year there were around nearly 6,000 complaints to the Aged Care Complaints Commissioner. Now, to put that into context, that's less than half of 1% of all occasions of care across all service types. Within residential aged care, there was around 4,300 complaints, which was about 2% of the total beds. Now, notwithstanding that, we deal with numbers every day, and what I've learnt in the last little while with regards to all the scrutiny of our industry, and in particular the survey information requested by the Royal Commission and by others, that at the end of the day, if it's your partner, your parent, your grandparent or loved one that's in aged care and that they have a complaint, or if there's been a failure of care or substandard care delivered, one example is one example too many. And that's the message that's coming out loud and clear with regards to the quality agenda in our industry. If we look at this in a little bit more detail, in residential aged care there were 209 TFIs or timetables for improvement that were issued in that 17-18 financial year, and there were 72 review audits conducted. So this is where the Aged Care Quality Agency has been instructed or requested by government or the Commissioner to go in and investigate an issue. Across the country you can see the review audits conducted by the state, and New South Wales, although in the complaints was only around 30% of total complaints received, it's around 70% of the total number of audits. So there's obviously an issue underway there in New South Wales, not only with the number of audits, but then, the number of serious risk identified as well. In residential care, hopefully you're familiar with the consumer experience reports. For the first time in 17-18, there were over 15,000 of these reports, interviews conducted with residential care residents and their families. This was across 1,100 facilities, and they are proving to be a very useful and insightful tool for our industry as a whole, but also for many providers that are using them on a more regular basis. So, for example, some insights with regards to the question to the resident: do staff treat you with respect, or do you feel safe here? On both occasions, around 98% of residents responded that they felt those things most of the time or always. Now, ideally that's 100%, but as a baseline for the first time in using these reports, I think that's a pretty good place to start. Notwithstanding that, in response to do you like the food here, or if you're feeling a bit sad and worried there's someone I can talk to, there was a further gap between those that felt always or most of the time, and we were actually getting reporting that some of the time or none of the time was also a part of the response rate, and so obviously room for improvement in those areas. I think what's also interesting is in the application of these the consumer experience reports, the providers were also asked for their views with regards to the usefulness or otherwise of these reports. Now around 20% or so were saying that they didn't really see a great deal of value. Around 30% were going, we'll wait and see, but around 50% were actually quite satisfied that this was a useful tool. And as I said, many of our members are currently now using these tools on a regular basis to continually improve and engage with their residents and their families to ensure that expectations are being understood and met. In home care, there were 69 services issued with TFIs, and of those, 23 did not resolve the expected outcomes by the end of the TFI. And if you look at the averages across there, standard 1 was where, on average, most providers who had issues with the regulator were being held to account. In seniors housing, in response to a survey around how well would you say your village meets the expectations of each of the following, the top 3 issues that were identified as below expectations was availability of on-site care, access to managers and other staff, and village maintenance. Now those second and third issues are perennial issues, but the availability of on-site care is one that, as I'd mentioned earlier in the presentation, is now becoming a must-have, and definitely been seen as something that is now an expectation that would be provided in retirement village settings. Now for anybody in the industry, you'd have to be asleep at the wheel if you weren't aware of the new Quality and Safety Commission, and in particular the introduction of the new Quality and Safety Standards as of the 1st of July. Now this is a significant reform in the journey of the aged care industry, and LAYS has been doing all we can to support our members through information and masterclasses, and even the introduction of our safety and quality management system tool. So we'd certainly be keen, if you need any further support, to contact LAYS in that respect. I have to say, travelling around the country in recent times talking to providers, there is a concern that as an industry we are behind the timetable with respect to meeting the 1 July expectation that from 1 July all services will comply with the new quality and safety standards. If you are feeling that you are behind the timetable, please reach out to us and we'll do all that we can to support you as you transition to the new standards. So if, again, if I'm sitting in your shoes, obviously transition to new standards is a key issue. The Zimmerman inquiry made a number of recommendations that I think are worth noting. So there is no doubt there will be increased transparency to come with regards to performance of residential care facilities and home care providers. Now, issues around non-compliance, issues around complaints and reportable incidents, and the mandatory national quality indicators, these are all reforms that are coming that will add transparency to the information that's out there in the public domain that will help inform choice for consumers. Another area to note is the in retirement villages, LAYS work with the Property Council of Australia to introduce a new single national accreditation scheme and also a code of conduct for all RV providers. So again, if I'm in your shoes, I'd be asking myself, are our quality systems and processes fit for purpose, particularly with respect to the new quality standards? What would increased transparency mean for our business? Are we tracking issues around non-compliance, complaints, reportable incidents and the like? The new national quality indicators, what would that say about our business, and how are we using that information to continuously improve? I'd also be asking, where's the consumer voice in our business, and is there meaningful engagement? Because this is all aligned to continuous improvement, increasing choice, and also the transition to the new quality standards as it's not just a compliance matter, it's an issue around culture and behaviours and mindsets within the industry. And if you're an operator of retirement villages, are you signed up for the new accreditation scheme and code of conduct? And finally, again, looking back to the new quality standards, how is quality assured at the governance level in your business? Because this is an issue of increasing importance and scrutiny. If we now look at workforce in some further detail, so in the ACFA report of 2018, looking at 16-17 data, we see that the workforce is older than the national average. There's around 360,000 paid workers employed in the industry. It's a relatively stable workforce, and in residential care, around a third of the workforce is born overseas. Now, in the ACFA report, it did mention that there are high levels of job satisfaction, but there are also some issues, and this particular graph was from an independent review looking at sustainable career pathways in the industry, and it does corroborate what the ACFA report says, that there are high examples or high levels of job satisfaction recorded. So is the job satisfying, is the job rewarding, 75 to 80%. Notwithstanding that, there are some issues for us to consider. Opportunities for promotion is an area of significant dissatisfaction, as is levels of remuneration. But I think also importantly and perhaps worryingly is 67% of people in this particular survey reported that the job is stressful. Now, the cumulative impact of stress on individuals in the workplace is well known, and in an industry that's currently undergoing significant change through reform, but also significant scrutiny through the Royal Commission process, being able to support our staff to help them navigate what is can be a difficult time is of primary importance for all providers. If we look at the Aged Care Task Force workforce, the Aged Care Workforce Task Force recent report, they did note that there were some considerable challenges within the industry, notwithstanding that it's one of the fastest growing job markets in the country. Now, these results here are a small sample size, but nonetheless insightful with regards to employee engagement levels and also employee enablement levels. So in the aged care sector, employee engagement, that is how engaged am I in the work that I'm doing, is well below the healthcare average, the healthcare norm, the Australian norm, and indeed what high performance looks like. Similarly with employee enablement, so I may well be engaged in the work, but does my employer enable me to deliver good quality, high performance? Again, aged care norm or the aged care results is below the healthcare norm, the Australian norm, and what high performance looks like. And for all of you in a service industry, you would understand that if we want to deliver a great experience for our residents and our clients, that starts with delivering a great experience for our workers. And so ensuring that we're supporting our employees as best as we possibly can is fundamental to be able to delivering great quality to all our clients and our residents. If you look at skills shortages, around 2/3 of residential care facilities reported issues around skills shortages, most notably in the clinical areas, and around 50% of home care providers also experienced challenges recruiting people in the reported year. If we now look across the RV space with regards to workforce, the perennial issue around making sure that the on-site staff, in particular the village manager, is approachable, is engaged, and is seen to be acting competently and professionally, continues to be quite variable across the industry. Now, I hope all of you viewing this have read the A Matter of Care report. This was the Aged Care Workforce Task Force strategy that has basically mapped out a game plan to support the aged care workforce over the next decade or so. I believe it's beholden upon every provider, everybody involved in the industry to read this report. It is a significant piece of work that provides a very practical insight into the issues of the day, but also as a provider, what are the practical things that you could be doing around workforce planning, skills mix modelling, industrial relations, all of the things that would underpin a flexible, high-performing workforce. If you haven't read this report, I urge you to do it. I believe that it's absolutely a fundamental importance for all providers to be across the level of detail in the strategy and to support its implementation. So, again, sitting in your shoes, I'd be very concerned around the cumulative impact of change fatigue, scrutiny and stress on my workforce. So what is it that I'd be doing to support my employees in times of change? I think the public perception of aged care is having an impact on staff attraction and retention, and again I'd be looking to identify what I need to do to be able to support my staff to remain engaged with the work that they're doing. I'd also suggest that implementing the workforce strategy is an absolute priority for industry. So if I'm sitting in your shoes, I'd be asking, how are we providing an outstanding employee experience? Is our approach to attracting, retaining and developing our workforce working? And what strategies do we have in place to support staff in these times of change and challenge? I'd also start to consider what's the opportunities for innovation and redesign of work using new technologies and new skills. And harking back to the A Matter of Care report, looking at the alignment between models of care, business models and skills mix, I think is fundamentally important to the future of your organisations going forward. Now I'd like to spend a little bit of time just talking about the reputation of the industry and also the reputation of individual providers. Now you would all appreciate that there's been significant mainstream media interest in our industry, resulting no less in a Royal Commission into aged care. Now regrettably, notwithstanding the thousands of people and providers across the industry that do an outstanding job every day in meeting the needs of older Australians, there have been exceptions, and these exceptions are unacceptable, and these exceptions regrettably is what our entire industry is judged on. And if you look at again reflections from Trent Zimmerman in his recent inquiry into quality and safety in residential aged care, he acknowledges that there's been a number of inquiries looking at major deficiencies and things that need to change. There's any number of reports and recommendations out there. But I think he hit the nail on the head, is that this is what we need to do, is deal with getting confidence and trust back in Australia's aged care system. And this is not just confidence and trust of the community with providers, but I'd also argue the confidence and trust of providers with the other elements of the system across regulation, policy and funding and the like. Going back to that recent research I mentioned earlier, conducted by Faster Horses in Western Australia, in response to the statement, "I have a high degree of trust in the aged care industry," less than 1 in 5 Australians said that they have a high degree of trust in our industry. And quite alarmingly, if you had a family member receiving care or services from our industry, only 1 in 4 said that they had trust in our industry. Again, through that same survey, in response to the statement, aged care organisations treat those in their care with respect and consideration. Only 2 in 5 people believe that to be the case in the general population. And if you have a family member in care or receiving support or services, only 1 in 2. Now this is a significant issue for our industry, and this is something that we all have to own and address. And I would suggest that if we don't, there are significant implications for our social licence to operate with respect to the support that we receive from the Australian government and from the wider community. And if you want to look at the impact of reputation on an industry, as a proxy, this is the share price trend for the 3 listed residential care companies on the Australian Stock Exchange. The point to note here is at the time of the announcement of the Royal Commission, they all took a significant dip in share price valuations. Now, for those organisations, that's an issue in and of itself, because that talks about confidence in the future of those organisations. But for the rest of the industry, what that then has a ripple effect around overall confidence in the industry, confidence in individual providers, and potentially an increased cost of capital for those providers looking to borrow to refurbish or to build. Now, I would suggest that the Royal Commission is, as we've said all along from the announcement of the Prime Minister, this is the once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to create a better aged care system. This is what LASER is focused on, and we're doing all we can to realise that objective through supporting our members and engaging wholeheartedly in the Royal Commission process. If I'm sitting in your shoes as an organisation, what I'd be thinking about is how can we be resilient in times of change, but also how can we be ready for what I believe will be a new aged care system post the Royal Commission. So the steps really that I'd suggest many of our members are taking is firstly responding to any request for information from the Royal Commission is absolutely essential. Many of our members have then taken those responses and critically reflected on what that tells them about their business. And some of them have been quite surprised at the things they've learned around culture, around governance, around systems and processes. And so from that, they're now looking to continue to deliver business as usual, as it were, but with this new lens around additional focus on continuous improvement. And whilst all that's going on, many of them are now thinking about, well, what is it that we need to be and to do to be future fit and future ready? So this comes back to looking at our strategy, about our business infrastructure, the workforce planning and core competencies, the models of care and change management capability, as well as the culture and the governance of the organisations. And throughout this entire process, communicating with your staff, with your residents, with your clients and with your essential and key stakeholders is an absolute must. Because at the end of the day, we need to own our reputation as an industry. And whilst individual organisations have their part to play, LASER, on behalf of the industry, also has our part to play. And in particular, we'll be looking to pursue the recommendation from the Aged Care Workforce Task Force to design and implement with industry a code of practice for the aged services industry in Australia. So with regards to reputation, the things to be noting is that the expectations of our industry and the scrutiny on our industry is only set to increase. The Zimmerman inquiry made lots of recommendations, again around transparency, which will no doubt come to bear. There's any number of third-party rating tools and social media commentary now emerging with regards to commentary on individual services, and that will just continue. And as I suggested, a focus on the Aged Care Code of Practice as an industry will give us the opportunity to take control of our reputation as an entire industry. So, if I'm in your shoes, how are we actively managing our reputation? Is our service offering and the performance of that offering meeting the needs of consumers and their families? And are we prepared to respond if and when we're challenged publicly on our quality or our performance? So looking forward across the industry, just some final reflections. I mean, Leading Age Services Australia, we're the industry association for all providers of aged services, and our tag is that we provide a strong voice and a helping hand for our members in times of change. That is only going to continue. We've got a very full dance card, as it were, over the coming year with regards to the Royal Commission. We've got a federal election currently underway. We'll continue to promote innovation through our Innovaging program. We'll continue to promote excellence through our Excellence in Aged Services National Awards programs. And there's many other activities that we do day in and day out in support of our members. And so any opportunity for our members to contact us, provide feedback on what we're doing well or in fact not doing well, and any service or support that you need, don't hesitate to reach out and contact us. So just in closing, let me leave you with these final remarks. David Choon, in his legislative review of aged care in 2017, said that aged care is in transition. I don't agree. I think aged care is in transformation. It is absolutely changing rapidly, and transition infers that there's some orderly process here. I would suggest that this is a disruptive transformation process that we're currently going through, and that will continue, particularly throughout the Royal Commission and obviously post the Royal Commission. The rise of the consumer, the needs and expectations of older Australians are changing. We understand that as an industry. But there's going to be even more focus on information transparency to support consumers to make informed choice. So that issue around how we're supporting choice and how reputation of individual providers plays into those choices will become more and more important. And equally, the reputation of the entire industry becomes also important in the eyes of the wider community. The quality reforms, we are in a new era with the new Quality and Safety Commission. Their mission statement is to protect and enhance the safety, health, well-being and quality of life of aged care consumers. That is a significantly expanded brief from the previous Regulatory Function and Complaints Commissioner. That, coupled with the introduction of the new Quality and Safety Standards, which as much as there's a system and process component to it, it's equally about cultural change, behavioural change and mindset change, both for providers and also the experience of consumers, that I would suggest that there is a significant shift happening, and that will play out over the next little while. And it'd be no surprise to our members to hear me say this, that I know we all aspire to having world-class quality and a world-class aged care system in Australia. We want nothing less. However, a world-class system requires world-class resources, that is funding, people and systems, and there is significant work that we need to do, and continuing to prosecute the arguments with government and the Australian people to ensure that we do have those world-class inputs to deliver the world-class outcomes that everybody desires. And finally, I'll leave you with a statement from Counsel assisting in the Royal Commission at the conclusion of the directions hearing in January. This statement basically says the way we care for older Australians need to change, and that it needs to change fundamentally. And I would suggest that that is heralding what I would see post the Royal Commission as a new aged care system, a better aged care system for Australia, one that will be future fit and meeting the needs of older Australians not only now but into the future. And so it's our role as an industry association, and all of your roles as providers of aged services, to support that agenda. And just know that Leading Age Services Australia is here to support you as you go about doing your important work of caring and supporting for and accommodating older Australians. Thank you very much for your time.